We're recording.
Okay. So I just wanted to record this and get started with this recording is not necessarily for the podcast, but I do want to dive in a little bit to you and I have been talking a lot about story and transforming story, but we're not talking about the elephant in the room.
What elephant is that?
Well, the fact that we've been talking about this for, I think I saw a document in the Google Drive that dates back to like April. And I think it goes back even farther than that. And
Yep.
This is now, in 2 days, it will be October. So here we are, and we're still meeting and developing and behind the scenes and planning and all that. So I think, well, we touched on the topic a few weeks ago that we're kind of hiding back here. I feel like we're kind of hiding behind the scenes.
Yes. Hiding in the planning stage.
Yes. So what's stopping us from moving ahead?
Sure. One of the things you also have in the notes for today's conversation is my interest in etymology.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
In the story of the words that we use, right?
Yes.
So what is stopping us from actually producing content that we are sharing with a wider audience?
Right.
I believe part of that is that we are comfortable in the planning stage.
Yeah.
I know I'm comfortable. I'm very well trained in planning and building models and looking into the future by looking at the past. And to go to the etymology of comfort is, you break that up into the two syllables, come and fort. Come means with, essentially.
Okay.
And fort is the same root that is in things like fortress or fortitude, or I'm not sure of fortune.
So protected. So like a protected area. Okay.
From strength, right?
Okay.
So we have strength in the planning stage.
Oh.
We have.
I love your etymology lessons. I get it.
And really, where that comes out for me is in both parts. One, the language that we use, we get comfortable with the language that we use. And that language can show up in word choice. It can also show up in the stories that we're telling ourselves, right?
Right.
And I know part of the story that I'm telling myself about all this planning that we've been doing is that we need to get it right and not just.
It's the perfectionist thing.
Yeah. And
okay.
Perfectionism for me is huge. It is.
Why? I mean, I know your story, that it goes back to, with your dad and all that. I get that, but I hear you say that often, which tells me you're holding on to it.
Well,
the perfectionism that,
yeah.
like, you're owning that you're a perfectionist. You're owning that part, but it sounds like you're owning it, but you don't like it. You're trying to get rid of it.
Yes and no.
Okay.
There are definitely aspects of it that I don't like. There are aspects of it that I do like.
Okay.
There's conflict around this whole idea of perfectionism. And ultimately, just to give a bigger picture, is that what I've realized is that the reason I hold on to perfectionism and am driven by perfectionism is that when I'm not perfect, then
People notice?
people notice, and not only do they notice, but they reject me for not being perfect.
Gotcha. Okay.
And yes, a large part of that goes back to my childhood, where I had a father who was also, and honestly, in many areas of life, far more of a perfectionist than I have ever been.
I've never owned that word. I suppose I qualify for it because I raised my kids saying, and I used to say this over and over again, is that good enough is not good enough.
Mm.
Because my mom would do something and she was notorious. She'd half-ass everything.
Mm.
I mean, she doesn't cleaning the house. She'll like wipe the crumbs away or something. But God forbid she grab a sponge and actually, clean the counter and then or spray something. Oh no, can't do that. So she'd half-ass it and she'd be like, "Oh, that's good enough. There's no crumbs on it. It's not dirty. You can't see it. It's good enough."
Yes.
So, and I raised my kids saying, good enough isn't good enough. Whatever you do, give it your all.
That is so interesting, because from what I understand, and my dad was raised in a family where his mother was almost the exact opposite of him, where she was more about good enough, and our house was not immaculate. And I grew up in literally an immaculate house. I mean, there was nothing ever out of place.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I lived in this grand castle that was, but we had
but everything you had, you were taught to take care of it. You were taught to keep things clean, keep things new for as long as possible. That kind of stuff.
Yes.
That's
yeah.
similar to myself.
Dad would, from his Navy days, would learn to flip a quarter off your bed to see if it was made well enough, right?
Yeah.
If it was tight enough. And I got pretty good at making my bed, and honestly, there are things that I appreciate about those experiences, in that I'm pretty good at keeping a relatively clean house.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pristine. You couldn't
Right.
bounce a quarter off my bed, but at least it's made.
Yeah.
And so I value it. So there's that conflict with perfectionism, between where things are never perfect, and they never are.
Right.
But there's also the benefit of continuous improvement, or of things being done in a way such that good enough. A sloppy job is not. If we're going to do something, do it well.
Right.
If you're not going to put your energy into it, why are you doing it?
Right.
At all?
Yeah. Why bother? Ken commented. Ken said something about, I think we were putting away dishes and I think I'd missed a spot on a plate or something. And he was like giving me a hard time about it, or, teasing me about it or something. And it took me back to, okay, Dad. Sorry, did I miss a spot?
Was your dad like that?
Yes, my dad was. Yeah, if you're going to do it right. And my dad was very much, you missed that spot over there.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly with my dad. I mean, there was always the gap between what I did and what his
Right.
expectation.
Yes. Yeah.
It
So
wasn't
yes.
just directed at me, and he was that way, maybe even far more so with
Oh yeah.
himself than he was
Oh
with me.
yeah. My dad too. Yeah, my dad too. It wasn't just at me, but of course, I was a kid, and as a kid, you hear things differently.
Yes, yeah, you
As a
feel very
kid, it's
personal.
got nothing to do with him. As a kid, I took it personally, and I was like, I can't do anything good enough,
Right.
or whatever I do, it's never going to be good enough.
Yes. Yeah. So, and it's for me, it stopped me from doing lots of things that
Mhm.
I eventually learned to give myself permission to do anyway.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that my mother would say to me towards the end of her life was when she'd see me drawing, she'd say, I don't remember you drawing. I don't remember you drawing. And she said it over and over again. And she wasn't, I mean, her mental faculties weren't what they once were, but she wasn't senile or anything. She was just tended to have a repeat.
Okay.
And the reason that she didn't remember me drawing because I didn't draw. I mean, I stopped drawing probably when I was, other than the occasional something, when I was early on in elementary school. Because for one thing, I looked at what Dad could draw and what he could do, and he could do figure drawing. He knew about light and shadow, and
Oh, okay.
so figure drawing was, you have a live model and you do a
Okay. Got it.
what is it word?
Drawing people.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
And I had to let go of that. It needs to look like this in order for me to create anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I had to let go of, and initially when I first started drawing, and I only started drawing roughly 7 years ago. And so well into my midlife.
Uh-huh.
But prior to that, I hadn't drawn anything in decades.
I haven't drawn in a long time. I don't draw. I don't. I haven't even tried. I used to when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So, and then I realized that I draw most of the stuff I draw. What I draw well is realistic stuff. I remember my grandfather was an artist. And strange as this may sound, it's a weird memory, but I remember sitting in his basement, and he had shelf units, like in a warehouse, and they were full of cartons of cigarettes. The empty cartons. My grandmother smoked like a chimney. And there were cartons of cigarettes stacked on there, and he just thought that it was he liked the colors, he liked the shapes and stuff like that. And I remember sitting in the corner in the basement with a pad of paper and a pencil, and I was drawing like the corner of the ceiling and the corner of the shelves, and just practicing drawing the corners to practice the 3D effect.
Right. Perspective.
Yeah. So I don't know why I remember that particularly. I have a lot of holes in my memories. So the memories that I do have, to me, they represent something. They mean something.
Right.
So, and actually I never thought of using the word perspective in that. And that's ironic, because look at what I do now.
So tell me.
Well, what I do now is I teach people how to see things from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, I was so set on drawing exactly what I saw If I would move, if I would just move a few inches over, it would have been a whole different perspective. I would have to draw the lines at different angles than what I see them now.
Yes, right.
So it's a whole different perspective just from, a few inches to the left or to the right. It's a whole different perspective.
That's one of the things that I've learned from photography, which is another practice that I have started in the last 7 years.
Yeah.
Is, how close, how far away, do I come from this angle? Do I come from this angle? These infinitesimal, seemingly, changes can dramatically change the outcome, right?
Right.
So, and again, it's perspective. And I bring that into story too, in that, from what perspective am I telling the story?
Right.
And from what kind of energy am I bringing into that story, right? So
Yeah.
when I'm looking at my story, like getting back to how we began with, we've been talking about doing this podcast for months and months.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, occasionally, but we've been meeting weekly.
I know, we've been meeting weekly on it. So that I've stuck to this longer than I have for a lot of things. So I know it's going to happen. And I love the fact that we're doing it together, because I feel like you and I are walking the same journey together.
Yes.
So it's almost like we're walking down the road, like I've got someone holding my hand. and we still haven't pulled the trigger. So, okay. So I'm holding myself accountable for my own part in it, but I'm holding you accountable for your part in it too. And that's my intention with this conversation.
Sure.
Is to kind of like, okay, let's figure this out, and let's light a fire under it and
make something happen. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can look at it from the perspective of somehow we have, and it seems right now that we have an undeclared expectation as to what this is supposed to look like for us to put it out there into the public. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say, we are here. This is where we actually are. This is where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, we feel that we're not yet to this point. And so we haven't pulled the trigger, as you say.
Right.
We haven't launched, haven't published, made public this podcast. So we can look at it from the perspective of the gap between where we are right now.
Okay.
And what our expectation is. Or we could look at it from the perspective of where we began and where we are now, and how far we've come in the months that we've been talking about this. Mm-hmm. For one thing, one of the things that's developed over these many conversations that we've had is one, I can say from my perspective, is I've gained a real appreciation for who you are, and what we bring to this conversation collectively. I'm continue to be amazed at how similarly we look at story, look at life, look at, even bringing, the perspective into things.
Right.
That we have this conversation and this framework of story that really means something to both of us, right? And so we can look at it again, going back to perspective, we can look at it from the perspective, the gap between where we are now and where we want to be, or we can look at it from the perspective of what we've already accomplished. Right. So, which I think is a more powerful place to look at it, because we can say—
I'd be happy to tell you my perspective of that too.
Sure.
Well, for starters, I want to reiterate what I just said a few minutes ago, that I appreciate the fact that this is the longest that I've stuck to something, like with like knowing what the goal is. This is the longest that I've stuck to it, and I haven't like revised the vision. You know, because do you have any? I've started my book. I have like 15 different versions of the start of my book. And I've yet to get past like 20 pages in. I've yet to get past that, but I have 20 different, that times 20 different versions of it. So I've actually written like 400 pages. So I appreciate for myself, I appreciate the growth and the fact that I know that this is happening, that this isn't one of my fly by night, schemes or whatever, so, and I love the fact that, like I said, I have someone holding my hand, and that to me truly means a lot.
Yeah.
Also, in these months that we've been meeting regularly, first of all, I very much look forward to our regular, every week, every Tuesday, I know I can count on that you and I are going to talk.
Right.
And oftentimes it turns into a therapy session for either or both of us.
Right.
I think that you and I have gotten to know each other, and I consider you one of, excuse me, I consider you one of my closest friends. I mean, I've talked to you about stuff, I've talked to you because of those therapy sessions. I've talked to you about stuff that I haven't talked to anybody else about. Some I haven't talked about in years, some I've never talked about, some I didn't even realize until we talked, and I appreciate our time together and the relationship that you and I have built. And I too continue to be amazed at the similarities between our stories, between our beliefs, between our challenges, things that we have overcome, things that we have yet to overcome, that we're still working on. So anyway, that's where I stand as far as where we are now compared to when we started.
Sure.
So, and when I say let's kick this into gear, I'm not harping on you or anything like that. And I don't want you to, okay. So like I said, I'm owning my part in this too.
Yes.
So
well, I think that's the really cool part is, we both, I've created lots of things on my own, but it remains essentially either literally or figuratively on my internal hard drive, right?
I like that. Yeah, literally and figuratively. Yeah, mine too.
And I can either leave it there or I can bring it out and, help other people with what I have discovered so far.
Right.
I might not be to the one and final answer as to, how do you use story in life, or what is my life story, right. Whatever.
I think the word, what is the, I'm going to encroach on your expertise here. Okay. What's the etymology behind the word story?
That is an interesting question. What I can tell you is, what I can tell you is that I find it really interesting that we call a story like you can say you've got a 100-story building or a 2-story house or a
Right. Levels, layers.
yeah, and part of that
I never thought about that. That's a good point.
part of it is just the way that there are different friezes, right? So
Okay.
artwork that happens on different stories.
Okay.
So there's that element of there of kind of being layers.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but that is a good point. Is, you know, the different layers of a building, different layers of a story, I guess.
Huh. So it actually, looking at the etymology of it, it comes from Middle English, which comes from the Greek, which has to do with history, right?
Okay.
Which if you look at the word history, you
His
one of the
story.
ways some people use it is, you know, let's say his story, right?
Right.
But it actually, the original Greek word, Middle English from Latin, from Greek, historia, which means learning or knowing by inquiry or history, a derivative of histor, one who knows or sees, right?
Okay.
So, and you think about the storytellers throughout history, the bards of old, or, you know, the people who are known for telling stories today, whether that be a journalist or a filmmaker or a novelist or whatever, is that they provide a lens through which we can view the world.
Right.
So the storyteller's job, if you will, is to capture their view on the world, which interesting. I'm just making this connection back to perspective of, you know, they're providing their perspective on the world, and they might provide that perspective in different ways. That it might show up as, you know, a novel.
Right.
It might show up as a movie. It might show up as a sculpture. It might show up as a building. You know, there are these, they are taking their perspective and making something from that perspective, right? So that others can see it as well. Whether
I love, I enjoy sci-fi. I enjoy a lot of sci-fi. An example is, I love the movie The Matrix. And I've learned a new appreciation for it now, given what I do and about creating your own reality and that kind of stuff. I also often use the phrase, welcome to the future. I literally will say that to a store clerk that's, you know, complaining about her, you know, her cash register's not working or something. Welcome to the future, you know?
So what do you mean by that? So in that context, what are you saying to the store clerk?
Well, for example, let's say she's having a hard time figuring out the cash register because there are, you know, she's not sure which button to press to do something or whatever.
Right.
And technology is supposed to make our lives simpler. You know, but then we get so stressed out about these things that are a result of technology. So when I say that, it's, you know, at the time I'm saying, you know, welcome to the future. It's, you know, there are advantages to being in the future, but then there's also, once in a while, you're going to get frustrated that you're used to old school.
Yes.
You're used to old school, and welcome to the future.
Why can't they remain the same?
Right. Yeah. So like I like doing math problems by hand. I don't always pull out a calculator. When I first moved down here, I pulled out a piece of paper to add something up, and Ken noticed that, and he said that was one of the things he appreciates. Was that I do it by hand, because he knows I'm into numbers. I do, I play with numbers a lot.
Yes.
So, and he appreciated the fact that I'll do it by hand. I'll actually write out the math problem. I'll figure it out on paper. I don't necessarily pull out a calculator to figure things out. And sometimes for me, it's easier to visualize, where I can see like this number came from here, this number came from here, here's what I'm doing here. It just makes more sense on paper.
Yep. Yeah. So, and there's actually levels of math that, I mean, I'm sure you can plug it into a computer or something in order to get
right
the answer for trigonometry or calculus or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, to me, those look like a different language.
They are a different language.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't get that far in school, so that means nothing. The whole, I see exponents, I see, all things with pi in it. I have no idea. I know what pi is, but I don't know what to do with it.
Eat it.
Exactly.
But yeah, well, it's just, again, a different perspective, and it's a different, if you will, language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So right. the reason I asked about the etymology of story, which I think out of everything that, like, I know you looked it up and you read it and everything, I think out of all of that, my biggest takeaway from it was when you mentioned the correlation between that and different stories of a building. Because that made me think of layers, and that made me think of the layers of a story.
Yes.
So we've heard people talk about, as we tell the story, we're peeling back the layers, just like an onion.
Right. Well, that's what's really I'm talking about your 20 versions of your book. I am literally on the 8th draft of.
Oh, it was 7 last I heard. Okay. Okay. So good. It's not just me.
No. And for me, it's not just the first 20 pages. I have done this. I have completed 50,000 words in each, at least 6 of those drafts. And I'm starting again from the beginning on this 8th draft. And it honestly, and they're different layers, right? So the story that I began to tell on story number 1, on layer number 1, draft number 1, is very different than the one that I'm developing today. And one of the ways that I actually do it is figuring out, well, how much more do I need to put into this layer, right?
Right.
There's not only the change in, well, what is the story all about? What is changing from the opening of the story to the conclusion of the story?
Okay.
So that has been a really important part for me, is getting clear on what is the change that I'm bringing about, because then I can lead up to, okay, this is the deciding moment when I decide, am I going to go, which way am I going to go? And it's the kind of the climax of the whole story.
Right.
And until I got clear on what that was, and this, where I've settled with that is accepting the story as it is, right? Which is kind of ironic, because I'm realizing, as we talk about in this episode about, publishing, is that, accepting it as it is rather than it having to be something else. When I get to this point, then it will be fit for public consumption, right? And until I get to that point, it's staying on this side of the screen. right? And so, and part of in coming to that conclusion in the memoir that I'm writing is just accepting, you know what, I am where I am, you know, and I don't need to be somewhere else. I can accept who I am, where I am, and what I'm doing, and trust that that will provide value for the right person, right? You know, so that, you know, we can keep working, pushing for the horizon in this developing our podcast, or we can accept that, you know, where we're at right now is where we're at right now.
Yeah.
You know, not somewhere in the past,
Right.
not somewhere in the future, but right here.
Right.
Right. So accepting that with regards to my memoir, accepting that with regards to my struggle with depression, accepting that with, you know, the publishing of our podcast, you know, all the various types of content that we put out into the world, is accepting it, that it is what it is now. I think too often we get caught up in the perfectionism or the despair of where we're at right now, instead of looking and saying, you know, where I'm at right now is actually pretty good. You know,
may I interject there?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I didn't want to interrupt if you weren't done yet.
No.
So one other thing that I want to add to my list of what I appreciate of where I'm at, of where we were versus where we are. First of all, the fact that we are telling people that we are working on this. So we are creating expectations. So there are people waiting for this to come out.
Yes.
So there once was a time where I would have either said, oh, we decided to scrap that, you know, or we decided to, you know, we're not going to do it. Or I would have just, you know, thrown something out there, or I would have said, okay, let's just hurry up and get so I would have rushed through the process to just get something out there because other people are expecting it.
Yes.
And then I would have kicked myself in the ass for, you know, because it would have turned out shitty. You know, it would have been a horrible thing, because we would have put this out months ago and not been ready for it. And, you know, so I would have rushed through because other people are expecting it. So it's progress that we're telling people, you know, so we're putting it out there. We are creating expectations, stuff like that. But it's also progress that we are okay with. And for myself, at least, I don't know about for you, but for myself, it's progress that I'm okay with. Let them wait. They can wait. I'm okay with that.
Yes.
So it'll happen when it's supposed to happen.
Yes.
So I've come to realize and appreciate everything, literally everything is for a reason. So everything, as far as, you know, the things we wait on, the things that we decide to not follow through with, whether we decide to circle back around and complete it later, or we decide to just scrap it and move on to something else, there's always a reason. So I may not know the reason now, but I've learned to make peace with, I don't have to beat myself over the head, you know, for all the times that I've, you know, screwed something up, or, you know, let something fall between the cracks, or, you know, whatever other, you know, mistakes I've made.
Right.
So I was actually reviewing I downloaded all my bank transactions the other day, and I was categorizing them. And the lump sum of money after I sold the house, I wanted to see how much I spent on clearing my debts. I spent $56,000 on clearing my debts. so that I could be where I am today.
Mm.
So now, as far as financially, I've never felt better. You know, I've had to start from scratch before. You know, after I got divorced, my ex-husband like did a number on my credit. So I had to recover from that. I filed bankruptcy back in 2009. I had to recover from that. But I've generally, for the most part, I've always been the one that people go to for financial advice. You know, I mean, I'm the one that's good with money and stuff like that, but I've made my share of mistakes. You know, I've invested in things I shouldn't have invested in. I've thrown money around where I didn't need to.
Right.
So I think that at one point, I think a few years ago, I did the math and I figured out that I've spent literally over $1 million on, just financial mistakes, over the course of my life. But I learned something from every one of those mistakes. So
it reminds me of something I heard was in a investing perspective. And the comment that was made by this really successful investor was that they always got a good return on their investments. Every investment they ever made had a positive return.
Well, that's wonderful for them. What they learned from that.
That doesn't mean that they made money on it.
Right.
It means that they either made money or they learned something.
Exactly. Right. And I've definitely reduced the number of times and the dollar amounts that I've written off to, let's call this a life lesson. Because at some point it was, with every single one of those dollar amounts, there had to be a point where I'd call it, time of death, time of death. It's okay. At this point, I'm done fighting this. I'm done, trying to recoup this, trying to, make something out of it. At some point, I had to just call it and go, okay, at this point, this is done. This is in the past. I'm done dealing. So I've reduced the number of times and the dollar amounts of when that happens.
Yeah, I think I'm frequently going to the idea of life being a practice, right? So yoga being a practice, meditation being a practice, business being a practice.
Yeah.
Even finances being a practice, right? That as we practice, we get better at it. And for those, which reminds me of an exchange that happened in our Toastmaster meeting last Thursday, in which the comment was made, what does practice yield?
Oh, practice makes, yeah.
And you said that practice makes progress, right?
Right.
So how does our practice make progress? Which brings me back to, and I think, we're getting down to the point where we need to conclude this conversation, but we are engaged in a podcast practice.
As you were mentioning all the practices, I was thinking about it, and I guess our habits are all practices. We want to create a meditation habit. We want to have, good financial habits. These are all habits. So we practice our habits.
Yes. Yeah, and the better our habits, the more positive,
the more productive. Yeah.
And the more progress we make and so forth. So So I feel like this has been a good practice.
This one has definitely been good practice for upcoming.
Whether we publish this one or not,
Right.
it has been good practice. So
I'd like to hold on to these, even if we like, I can see us sharing them as kind of as blooper reels.
yeah. And honestly, your conversation about the money and everything makes me think about, and I'm going to stop the recording.